Every ranger trusts the trail beneath their boots until the footsteps chasing them are heavier, hungrier, and not their own. Tonight, Dreadscribe writes again. The forest at night has a way of shrinking the world down to breath, heartbeat, and the crunch of boots on pine needles. That evening the air was sharp with resin, each inhale thick with the scent of pitch. I'd walked this trail 100 times before, but familiarity doesn't soften the shadows. Pines towered like cathedral spires, their branches knit into an uneven ceiling that blocked the stars. Somewhere in that silence I whistled, just a short tune to break the tension, the way you'd hum to yourself in a dark room. The sound echoed off the trees and vanished. Then, impossibly, it came back. Not as an echo, not fading as sound always does, but whole, crisp, too clean. The same pitch, the same timing, as though the forest had decided to answer me. For a moment, I froze, my breath caught like a moth in glass. My rational mind rushed to explain it, sound bouncing in a canyon, the peculiar acoustics of dense trunks. But there were no canyon walls here, just endless rows of pine. The branches swayed above me, skeletal fingers dragging across one another in the wind, as if applauding the mimicry. I whistled again, sharper this time, daring whatever was out there to respond. The reply came instantly, not delayed, not altered. Perfect. I felt the hair on my arms rise, a primal warning older than language itself. Some part of me whispered, "This isn't reflection, it's intention." I gripped the radio on my shoulder, thumb pressing the call button. Static hissed, then warped into a distorted murmur, like words torn apart before they could be understood. A ranger's lifeline is his radio, but that night it felt like a trapdoor. My own voice crackled back at me, fragmented syllables, chopped into nonsense, as if someone or something was replaying my speech from inside the wires. The deeper I stepped into the forest, the more the air seemed to thicken. Pines stood closer together, their trunks crowding like a jury, watching silently as I trespassed deeper into their domain. Every crunch beneath my boots was mirrored by a faint shuffle in the dark. My chest tightened, not from exertion, but from a creeping certainty that I was no longer walking alone. Science insists that forests hold sound differently, that needles and bark scatter echoes in uncanny ways. Acousticians call it diffuse reflection. I clung to that thought like a lifeline. Yet no textbook had ever explained why my whistle returned with a breathy undertone, like someone exhaling through my tune. No lecture had warned that a sound could carry intent. The trees pressed closer, the trail dissolving into a carpet of shadows and frost. I remembered an old biologist once telling me that plants respond to sound, that roots bend toward vibrations, that leaves shiver at certain frequencies. I laughed then, dismissing it as fringe science. But now, with every whistle answered, I wondered, what if the forest wasn't just absorbing my presence, but listening? I raised the radio again, desperate for human confirmation. Through the static came not a ranger's call sign, but a thin, almost childlike whistle. Mine, but not mine. The sound seemed to curl around the trees like smoke. My pulse hammered in my ears. And then I heard footsteps. They weren't mine. The footsteps matched the metronome of my fear, quickening when I quickened, pausing when I froze. Needle duff crushed under something heavier than me, deeper than my tread, a drum under snow. I turned slowly, beam carving pale ribs from trunks, catching only knots and twisted branches, photos torn. The whistle drifted again, my notes returned with a bend, as if a finger smudged the sound and signed it. Training. Says count, breathe, observe. I forced air in and out, counting to 4 like a diver while the night tried to unright me. To my left, frost crackled. I swept the beam low, impressions wide and long, tread. Each print wore a halo of needles, a ring of iron filings. When I pressed my palm to the soil, it shivered like a page stirred by a draft. I told myself about birds, the lyrebird copying chainsaws, the mockingbird singing alarms. Intelligence can wear feathers, mimicry can be survival. But this wasn't practice. It was a mirror with opinions. The whistle returned with the hitch I'd taken between breaths, a cartographer using my lungs for ink. Then the radio lilted again, less static now, a fine thread murmur. I heard my name inside it, stretched like wire under frost. Elena taught me to treat silence as a colleague. At dawn, she tapped the tower rail and said the air had already filed its report. 2 winters later, she vanished on a storm sweep, her last transmission swallowed by weather. Loss makes the ribcage an echo chamber. Maybe grief was translating the trees, yet grief doesn't leave breadcrumbs. A ribbon of frost glittered ahead like a fuse awaiting flame. I followed because staying meant living with the question. The forest opened into a shallow bowl, an auditorium of bark. Acoustics shifted. My breath came back rounder like a word in a clay pot. The center was bare soil, circular, smooth, as if something heavy had sat and slowly turned, polishing the ground with hunger. My light found nylon strands on a splintered stump, pale as veins under thin skin. Sound systems use feedback to find limits. Microphone, speaker, loop. At the rim, I whistled a single note, clean as I could. The answer didn't bounce. It unfurled with faint harmonics, a chord tuned by an unseen hand. My radio aligned, making a duet of fear. Somewhere beneath, a hum deepened. The bowl felt like a chest cavity taking breath. Whether it planned to exhale, and what, I could not tell. There was a presence at the periphery, no shape, only pressure, like power lines singing before you hear them. I thought of the wood wide web, murmurs trading carbon and warnings, and wondered if we were arrogant calling it a network. Networks transmit, this conversed. Footsteps resumed, a pace too close, compressing pine air into something animal. The whistle arrived from 2 directions, like a decision splitting in half. No. Textbook prepared me for the scent lifted. Smoke and orange peel, Elena's thermos tea. Recall of a winter patrol, resurrected with tenderness. The forest wasn't echoing. It was sampling, feeding my past like a lullaby with teeth. A claw ticked bark, counting. I stepped into the circle. The ground answered hollow, a drum on a floor. The whistle touched my ear as breath. Stay or run. Which word had it learned? I came upon the campsite just as dusk folded itself into the valley, painting the pines in bands of indigo. At first glance, it looked ordinary. 2 tents pitched neatly, a fire pit still glowing with orange embers, and a lantern swinging from a low branch as though someone had just walked past. Yet the air was wrong. It carried a metallic tang, sharp like rust or blood, layered beneath the familiar wood smoke. Silence pressed down hard, heavy enough to feel like a second body on my chest. Even the insects seemed to have surrendered there. Voices. The details sharpened with every step closer. A pan of beans sat half-eaten on a flat rock, steam long gone but spoon still resting in place, as if waiting for a hand that would never return. A jacket was draped across a folding chair, sleeves open like empty arms reaching toward me. The ground told its own story. Boots had circled the fire, pacing, restless. But halfway through a stride, the print stopped. Not turned aside, not scattered, just ended, as though the person had stepped off the earth itself. I crouched to inspect the soil and froze. Gouges scarred the dirt, deep claw marks running in parallel, 4 lines repeating in uneven arcs. They weren't tidy like the scrapes of a tool. They looked frantic, ripped into the ground as though something had fought to stay tethered to the surface. My flashlight beam caught shredded fibers tangled in the clawed grooves, fragments of nylon, strands from the tent wall perhaps, or something stranger. I traced the lines with my glove, and the grit stuck like ash. The rational part of me summoned explanations. Maybe bears, maybe panic. Yet the lantern still burned with a steady glow, its fuel somehow untapped, a quiet metronome of normalcy in the middle of chaos. A lantern can't lie, but it can witness, and its unwavering flame felt like an accusation. My mind reached for science, adrenaline, fight or flight, the odd choreography of fear. But how could adrenaline erase a body mid-stride? How could Fear carved claw marks into the soil without leaving a trail away? I circled wider, letting the light cut through shadows. That's when I saw the tree. The bark was flayed in strips, curling like peeled skin, with more of those gouges climbing. Halfway up the trunk, the pattern suggested not climbing but dragging, as if someone had been pulled upward against their will. Above, the branches creaked, too stiff for wind. It felt like the forest had clenched its jaw around a secret dot. Memories of old ranger folklore whispered back. Stories of places where the land itself opens, consuming trespassers like swallowed stones. I'd always laughed them off, chalked up to whiskey and long winters. But standing there, breath fogging in the iron-scented air, I felt like I was living inside one of those tales. Every object left behind, the food, the fire, the jacket, was less a remnant than a question. Who sets a table and never eats? Who leaves a fire glowing without return? The silence deepened, dense and watchful, as though waiting to see what I would do next. And then, faintly, I noticed something I hadn't before. A low vibration under my boots, steady as a throb, like the heartbeat of something buried alive. I shifted my weight, thinking it might be the aftershock of my own pulse, but the rhythm didn't match. It was slower, heavier, like drums muffled under earth. Each beat sent a ripple through the soil, and suddenly the claw marks in the ground no longer looked like panic. They looked like resistance, the desperate anchors of someone trying not to be pulled under. I backed away instinctively, scanning the camp as if some hidden figure might step into the firelight and explain it all. Yet nothing moved. The lantern glowed steady, the beans sat untouched, and the chair leaned slightly toward me, like a confidant too afraid to speak. My breath fogged the air in short bursts, each one scattering and then vanishing like the missing hikers themselves. Forensics would want photos, samples, measurements, but I couldn't shake the feeling that evidence here wasn't physical. It was alive, still breathing through the soil beneath my feet, kneeling, I pressed my palm flat against the ground. It was warmer than the evening air, a faint heat radiating upward, not unlike standing over a subway grate. Pine needles trembled across the dirt, forming tiny patterns as if rearranged by invisible hands. My logical mind fought for control. Geothermal vent, gas pockets, natural explanation. But another thought threaded through, the idea that this wasn't heat from below, but breath, as though the earth itself inhaled beneath the campsite, and those who once sat here had been pulled into its lungs. I rose quickly, scanning the tree line. Every shadow looked staged, actors frozen mid-performance. The clawed tree loomed larger now, its bark stripped raw, fibers clinging like veins. I remembered an ecologist once telling me that trees can scream, releasing ultrasonic sounds. When stressed, frequencies our ears can't catch but our bodies sometimes feel. Standing there, spine prickling, I wondered if I was feeling one long, silent scream etched into wood and soil alike. I forced myself to catalog, to stay ranger, not prey. 2 tents, one intact, one shredded, one lantern burning, one missing, food abandoned. Footprints terminated mid-stride, gouges in ground and bark. Low subterranean vibration, possible geothermal anomaly, or something unrecorded. The bullet points gave me the illusion of order, a paper wall against the rising chaos inside me. Yet even as I listed them, the vibration deepened, rising into my legs until my teeth faintly rattled. Then came the sound, not a growl, not a rumble, but a chorus of faint echoes, like dozens of voices pressed into stone, speaking from beneath. They weren't words, not in any language I knew, but a cadence that felt rehearsed, deliberate, a liturgy repeated by generations. My radio hissed once on my shoulder, flickered, then died. The silence afterward was worse, because now the voices weren't below. They were around me, threading between the trees, whispering without air. I stepped back, lantern light shrinking as if the night itself leaned forward to snuff it out. And I realized something. The campsite hadn't been abandoned. It had been absorbed. The people, the noise, even their footprints, folded into the forest's memory dot. The ground shuddered again, harder this time. I stumbled, eyes locking on the shredded tent wall. Its nylon rippled once, as though stirred by breath from the inside. And then, silence so absolute it felt like the pause before an answer. What if the forest hadn't just taken them, but was waiting to decide if it wanted me to? The forest at night has a peculiar way of shrinking distance. What seems near is often far, and what should be far can feel suddenly close enough to touch. That night, as I patrolled the ridgeline, a faint orange glow appeared between the pines. At first glance it was comforting, the simple pulse of firelight swaying in the dark. I assumed it was another ranger finishing his rounds, maybe checking traps or warming hands against the cold. But the flame was too steady. It didn't sputter, didn't fade in the wind. It moved as though it belonged to the dark itself. I stopped, narrowing my eyes. The lantern seemed to hang at chest height, a small sphere of certainty in a wilderness that rarely offered any. Yet when I took a step toward it, the light didn't grow nearer. It shifted, slipping just beyond reach, as if the forest had lengthened the trail between us. My boots crunched against frozen soil, the sound loud in the silence, but the glow kept its distance, always visible, never attainable. Like a fading memory that refuses to vanish entirely, it stayed just enough to keep me chasing. I told myself fatigue was playing tricks. The mind, when deprived of light and rest, invents things. Scientists call it autokinesis, when a fixed point of light seems to move against the dark. Pilots in World War II saw phantom stars dance across their cockpits. Perhaps that was all I was seeing, a tired illusion etched against pine shadows. But illusions don't leave marks in the frost. I bent low where the lantern had hovered moments earlier. The snow was pressed down by a series of prints, human-sized, clear, leading further into the woods. The treads were sharp, too fresh to belong to anyone who should have passed this way hours before. I ran my glove over one impression. It was warm. Heat radiated from the frozen earth as though something burning had just stood there. My pulse thudded in my ears. Logic demanded I radio in, call for backup, report a possible trespasser. But something deeper urged silence. To speak aloud would be to break whatever strange agreement existed between me and that light. So I pressed forward, each breath leaving clouds that seemed to chase me, each step bringing more prints, all pointing deeper into the dark dot. The lantern guided me with cruel precision, weaving between the trunks. Sometimes it lingered still, letting me nearly catch up, then slid ahead again with impossible speed. The rhythm of it became hypnotic, like chasing a heartbeat you could never quite reach. My legs carried me without permission, drawn not by duty but by compulsion, as though the flame had written a promise into the marrow of my bones. I thought of Elena, the ranger we lost winters ago, her absence marked by a cabin that still carried her thermos and boots. She always carried a lantern like that one, its handle wrapped in red tape. A memory surged, sharp as glass, her laughter cutting through blizzards, her light bobbing in storms. Could grief shape the night into her silhouette? But the deeper question echoed louder. If this wasn't memory and it wasn't illusion, then whose fire still burned in a place where no one lived? The lantern swayed once more, then slipped beyond the reach of my flashlight. My boot struck the frost harder, chasing. And that's when I realized I hadn't once looked back. The realization struck me like cold water. I had been following that glow for nearly an hour without once checking the trail behind me. The forest had swallowed my path, leaving only black trunks and frost-glazed branches that pointed like spears. When I finally turned, there was nothing. No station light, no familiar markers, not even the crunch of my own footprints leading back. The snow was smooth, unbroken, as if the forest had erased every trace of where I'd been. Only the lantern remained, patient and swaying, asking me to choose, forward or nothing. I pressed on. The air grew thicker, every inhale tinged with a metallic bite that stung my throat. Pines crowded closer, branches knitting overhead until the night itself seemed sealed. The lantern flickered, and for the first time I thought I saw a silhouette carrying it. Shoulders hunched, head bowed, the outline of a figure half dissolved into shadow. My chest tightened. It was the posture of someone I once knew. Elena. Her shape etched into my memory like a watermark. But the rhythm was wrong. The steps didn't align with the glow. The light floated half a beat ahead, as if dragging the figure rather than being carried by it. I slowed, telling myself, exhaustion, Ben's perception. The human mind stitches fragments into stories, even when no story is there. Yet the snow told a different truth. Prints stretched before me in perfect symmetry, left and right. Deep impressions with ridges sharp enough to catch the light. They weren't fading behind, though. They were vanishing. As I watched, the last mark filled itself back in, frost knitting together like skin, healing in fast motion. It was as though the forest refused to allow memory to linger. Something shifted. In the silence, a hum, low and resonant, vibrated through the trees. It wasn't mechanical. It was organic. A tone that felt like the echo of lungs too massive to belong to anything I knew. The lantern pulsed in time with it, flaring with each thrum, then dimming to embers. My instincts screamed to turn back, to resist whatever rhythm the forest demanded. But a more terrible thought followed. If the trail had already erased itself, was there even a way back? At last, the glow stopped, hovering over a clearing dusted in snow. The ground here was bare of prints, as if no one had ever stood in this space before. I approached slowly, the beam of my flashlight trembling over the frost. The lantern swayed once, then twice, then vanished. Not faded, gone, extinguished in an instant, leaving the darkness absolute. For a heartbeat I was blind, caught something on the ground, a scorch mark, round and dark, burned into the snow. Steam coiled upward, carrying the bitter scent of charred earth. I crouched, reaching out. The heat was real, blistering even through my glove, far hotter than any lantern flame should leave. It felt less like fire, more like a wound in the earth. Still bleeding warmth. The hum deepened again, rattling my bones, and the trees seemed to lean closer, branches bowing as though eavesdropping. My breath came shallow, each exhale frost-painted. And in that moment, I understood the crueler question wasn't who carried the lantern, but what had been waiting for me to follow. The scream began as a thread, thin, frayed, stretched across the midnight silence. At first I thought it was a fox, their calls often mimicking something human. But this wasn't wild instinct. It was unmistakably a woman's cry, sharp and raw, cutting the forest open like glass dragged across skin. I froze, blood slamming against my ribs, my flashlight beam trembling over bark and frost. The sound came again, exactly the same pitch, the same length, as if the night had pressed replay. I forced my legs forward, boots crunching through pine needles, chasing the sound as though proximity would explain it. Each time the cry rang out, it was perfectly identical. The cadence never wavered, not the slightest breath or falter. That sameness unsettled me more than the terror itself. Real pain stutters, catches, changes. This was pain like a record, spinning without end. The forest seemed to grow heavier with each repetition, its silence between screams stretching longer, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Branches whipped against my jacket as I ran, and with every echo the sound didn't grow closer or farther. It simply was, stitched into the air as though sewn by invisible hands. My radio hissed faintly on my shoulder, but even that static seemed drowned by the looping cry. Scientists talk about auditory pareidolia, how our brains carve patterns out of chaos. Maybe it was just my mind grasping for familiarity in the randomness of sound. But if this was my brain inventing patterns, why did it feel like the forest was listening to the same endless track with me? I slowed at a clearing, my chest heaving, and the scream carried across the open space with eerie clarity. The moon painted the ground silver, and for a moment the frost sparkled like shattered glass scattered across a stage. Again the cry rose. The same as before. I clutched the flashlight tighter, its cone of light swaying like a nervous pendulum. The repetition gnawed at me, a cruel mimicry of time itself refusing to move forward. I remembered Elena once describing the woods as a memory bank of sounds, how valleys capture echoes, holding them for seconds longer than logic permits. I had smiled then, dismissing it as ranger poetry. Now, standing in that hollow silence, I wondered if she had been closer to truth than science. Maybe forests don't just remember, maybe they replay. And maybe some echoes aren't from the past, but from something that refuses to leave. The scream rose again, but this time it didn't stop when it should have. It dragged, stretching beyond its former limit, before snapping back into silence. My skin crawled, the loop had broken, something had altered it. A mindless recording wouldn't change, wouldn't improvise. This wasn't just memory, this was interaction. I took a single step back, frost crunching under my heel. And that's when I realized the silence between screams had become shorter, the rhythm tightening like a heartbeat quickening under strain. The forest wasn't simply replaying the cry anymore. It was accelerating it. And the next scream came from behind me. I spun around so fast the beam of my flashlight fractured against the trunks, slicing the dark into jagged fragments. My breath snagged in my throat. Nothing stood there. Just pine, shadows bending in the cold wind. But the scream had been behind me, I was certain. Its pitch still quivered in my bones, vibrating like a string pulled taut. I turned again, scanning the clearing, every nerve on fire. And then the cry came once more, not from a direction, but from everywhere. The forest itself seemed to exhale the sound, filling the air like smoke. Panic clawed at the edges of reason. I crouched low, pressing my hand against the frozen ground, as though it could anchor me. The earth felt colder than it should, as if the frost had burrowed deep, not just clinging to the surface, but threading down into stone. Another scream tore loose, same tone, same length, and I realized it wasn't echoing outward. It was radiating inward, folding into me, forcing my chest to tighten as though my lungs were the instrument producing it. My flashlight trembled across the soil, catching the thin outlines of old prints circling the clearing. So many layered, they blurred into a mess of directionless panic. I followed one set with the beam, only to watch it vanish mid-stride, swallowed by frost. My mouth went dry. Whoever had stood here before me hadn't finished their escape. The scream repeated, louder now, and the sound shook the frost from the branches overhead. Snowflakes spiraled down in slow arcs, glowing like falling ash. The moment should have been beautiful, but instead it felt funereal, a burial shroud drifting. From the sky, I forced myself to whisper reason into the chaos. Maybe it was a mountain lion. Maybe it was the wind sculpting sound through hollow trunks. But reason faltered when the scream bent mid-note, curling upward like a violin string tightened past its breaking point. It wasn't just repeating anymore, it was learning. The cadence shifted, no longer a perfect replica, but almost responsive. I clutched the radio on my shoulder, desperate for another voice. Static burst through, and within the static, faintly, impossibly, the scream carried. My stomach knotted. It was inside the frequency, stitched into the airwaves, like the forest had threaded its memory into electricity. I thought of sound studies, how recordings of the same note played over and over eventually dissolve into distortion. But what happens when distortion doesn't decay, but grows, like ivy feeding on stone? My ears ached, the pitch digging deeper, drilling past bone into marrow. I staggered toward the edge of the clearing, boots catching on roots. The trees loomed, taller, their branches knotted together like clasped hands keeping secrets. The scream came again, but softer this time, tender almost, like the last breath of someone slipping away. That change chilled me more than the shrieks. It was as if the forest wasn't just repeating pain anymore. It was imitating the shape of my fear, echoing not her suffering, but mine. I stumbled back to the trail, lungs aching, and the cry followed. Me, quieter with every step. until even silence carried its shape. Hours later, sitting in the safety of the station, the radio on my desk hissed once, dot, and faintly, underneath the static, the scream looped again, dot. The cabin revealed itself like a secret withheld too long. The trail had vanished into a tangle of roots and thorned brush, and yet there it stood, framed by pines that leaned like watchmen. Its windows were blackened with grime except for one, glowing faintly, flickering pale yellow as if a candle guttered inside. That kind of light doesn't belong in these woods. No power lines ran here, no seasonal hikers, no hunters reckless enough to settle this deep. Still, the glow persisted, steady as a heartbeat in the dark, dot. The porch groaned under my boots, every step releasing a puff of dust that coated the air with a flavor of wood rot and time. No prints marked the boards, no sign of entry, yet the door hung crooked on rusted hinges. When I reached out, it shifted first, creaking open with a sound like bone grinding in its socket. The gesture felt intentional, as if the cabin had been expecting me, as though it had decided on its own that the time for secrets was over. The air inside was wrong. It carried no musk of cedar or musty paper, but the sharp scent of damp earth, wet soil after rain, thick and mineral. Yet when my light skimmed the corners, there was no soil, no potted plants, no trace of mud tracked across the floorboards. The boards gleamed with dust so fine it resembled ash, unbroken except where something had passed through, unseen yet undeniable, dot. The lit room drew me like gravity. Its glow bled through the crack of a warped door, flickering faintly like a candle's nervous breath. I pressed the frame, and it swung wide, releasing a sigh that echoed in the hollow space. Inside was only a chair. It rocked gently, back and forth, creaking as if a body had just vacated it. No figure stood in sight, no lantern rested on the table. The glow seemed to come from the air itself, a light without source, like the memory of fire rather than flame. I stood frozen, the silence pressing closer, my own pulse filling the room like a drumbeat. My flashlight caught a sliver of motion in the corner, something quick, a ripple like fabric shifting when no one touches it. I snapped toward it, light cutting across cobwebs and peeling wallpaper. Nothing, only the chair, slowing in its arc, as if mocking my reaction. My throat tightened. Stories of residual hauntings floated back to me. Theories that emotion imprints itself on a place, replaying moments like grooves on a record. Scientists dismiss it as the mind drawing order from shadows, a neurological trick. Yet here, with the chair creaking like a metronome, it didn't feel like memory. It felt like invitation, dot. The glow dimmed slightly, enough to make the shadows crawl longer across the walls. My boots creaked against the floor as I stepped closer to the chair. Every fiber of me screamed to leave, to step back onto the trail, and never look behind me. But curiosity, sharper than fear, pushed a final arc until it stopped dead in place. And in the silence that followed, I felt the weight of eyes where no eyes should be, dot. Then the chair twitched once more, this time without moving back. It was as if something had finally settled into it, waiting for me to sit. I stood rooted, the weight of that chair heavier than any storm I'd weathered in the wild. My flashlight beam hovered over it, cutting a cone of pale white against the fading amber glow. The chair rocked once more, forward, then stilled. My instincts screamed that I was intruding, like a trespasser in a room that remembered its owner too well. The air thickened, carrying that damp earthen scent, and beneath it, something metallic, faint but undeniable, like rust or blood left too long in the rain. I forced myself to circle the room. The wallpaper peeled in long, curling ribbons, pale as dried skin, exposing boards blackened with age. My boots left impressions in the thick dust, but in certain places there were already trails. Narrow lines where something had passed before me. Not a mouse or insect. The tracks were too deliberate, too human in their spacing. Yet they ended abruptly at the chair, as though whoever made them had melted into it. My breath quickened, dot, The glow shifted, flickering brighter, and for a moment, I thought I saw a handprint pressed into the armrest. My beam caught the detail. 5 grooves darker than the surrounding wood, ridges that shimmered like scorched grain. They weren't carved, they were burned in, as if heat or pressure had diffused them there. The thought made my pulse stutter. Was the light itself leaving marks, or had someone once clutched that chair so hard they branded it with their grip? I leaned closer, fighting every instinct that warned me away. The room's silence pressed on me until I could hear only the hiss of my own breathing. Then came the sound, not loud, not even clear at first, but a murmur, like words muffled through thick fabric. My radio on my shoulder crackled once, a weak signal in dead country, and in that crackle, I heard it again. A whisper, a phrase that almost sounded like my name. I recoiled, heart slamming in my chest. The glow dimmed and swelled, as if reacting to my panic. I forced my thoughts into logic. Sound waves can trick, interference can bend signals, exhaustion can fabricate voices, but no theory explained why the chair creaked forward again, this time without rocking back. It leaned toward me, subtly but undeniably, like an invitation extended, or a command unspoken. I thought of the old ranger tales, the ones we laughed about during training. Places in the woods where time folds, where moments don't vanish but wait to be replayed. Places that aren't haunted by ghosts, but by expectation. Was this one of them? And if so, what did it expect from me? The glow contracted to a pinpoint, as if the entire room inhaled. My light faltered, beam scattering across the boards. For one suspended heartbeat, I swore I felt pressure on my shoulder, gentle, human, guiding. My knees buckled, and before I could resist, I was lowering toward the chair, as if pulled not by force, but by inevitability. Dot. The air stilled, the glow vanished, and in the pitch black that followed, the chair creaked once beneath me. Dot. Something unseen had been waiting for me to sit. Dot. The forest is supposed to be still at night, each sound isolated like a note in a fragile song. My boots pressed carefully into the trail, the crunch of frozen mud controlled, deliberate. Every ranger is trained to move this way, measured, aware, blending into the hush so as not to disturb what belongs to the dark. But that night, silence betrayed me. Because every step I took was echoed by another, perfectly synchronized, as if my own shadow had grown heavy and learned to walk. Dot. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Sound carries strangely in the woods. An echo might rebound from a ridge, or the trees could funnel noise in unpredictable ways. But no echo breathes, and I swear I could hear it, the faint exhale paired with the crunch, timed exactly with mine. Heel for heel, stride for stride, a mirrored presence tethered to me. The sensation coiled in my gut, twisting my instincts against reason. The rhythm was too precise to dismiss. I tested it. I stopped abruptly, holding my breath, every muscle locked. For a heartbeat, the world froze with me. Then, one final crunch, half a step late, like a dancer forgetting the choreography. The air between my ribs tightened. I turned sharply, flashlight beam slicing the dark. Only trees, only mist curling low, silvered by the moon. No eyes glinting back, no animal startled by the sudden pause. Just silence, wide and waiting. Dot. My pulse slowed, enough to remind myself of what the textbooks said. Isolation warps perception. Prolonged quiet makes the mind overinterpret noise. It wasn't the first time a ranger had reported phantom footsteps after long nights in the backcountry. Yet when I started walking again, the sound returned, this time slightly behind, slightly off, like whoever was following me had grown impatient. Their steps hurried as mine stayed steady, the crunch quickening as though they were trying to close the distance. Dot. Breath steamed from my mouth, a white plume rising like a distress signal. I quickened too, compelled not by reason, but by instinct. The trail snaked forward, narrow and slick, bordered by trees that leaned closer the faster I moved. Behind me, the pace grew frantic, no longer mirroring, but chasing. Crunch after crunch, the rhythm pounding against my spine, closing the gap with every heartbeat. I spun again, chest heaving, flashlight beam carving through skeletal branches. Nothing. The silence was worse than the noise pressing against my eardrums, making me doubt my own senses. But when I lowered the beam to the ground, I froze. There in the mud were prints, fresh, sharp-edged, the frost still melting around them. They weren't mine. Larger, deeper, impressed by weight I didn't carry. I crouched low, tracing the outline with my glove. The stride was wrong too, longer, uneven, as if whatever left them walked half human, half something else. My throat constricted, a knot of dread rising until it burned. I followed the line of prints forward, my light tracing each mark. They led further along the trail toward the cliffs I knew overlooked the valley. The last step pressed deep into the earth, and then nothing. The trail ended in silence. The prints stopped at the cliff's edge. And in that moment I had to ask myself, did something fall, or was it still waiting below? I edged toward the cliff, my boots sinking slightly into the damp soil, the night air colder here, sweeping up from the void below. The beam of my flashlight wavered across the drop, illuminating only mist, a restless gray that swirled and retreated like breath rising from a giant mouth. I expected to hear the hollow crash of water against rock, the rush of wind funneling through the valley. But instead there was only silence, vast and indifferent. Silence so complete it made my ears ring. I leaned forward, half expecting the prints to continue in midair, as if whatever I was chasing hadn't fallen at all, but walked straight into the void. I pulled back, my chest tight. Fear is like frost. It creeps in slow, unnoticed, until it stiffens everything inside you. I replayed the sound in my head, the hurried crunch, the stagger and rhythm, the way it had chased me rather than mirrored me. What if it wasn't me it had been copying, but testing, learning the pattern of my walk until it grew impatient? I turned sharply, scanning the trail behind. My light washed over empty trees, branches bare and brittle. Nothing moved, but the impression lingered, like heat after a flame. I forced myself down to one knee, studying the prints again. Larger than mine, spaced further apart, pressed deep with weight. The edges still glistened wet under the beam. They hadn't been here long, that much I knew. And yet the trail of them simply ended at the drop, as though erased by design. Predators leave signs, humans leave traces. But this was a narrative cut off mid-sentence. I thought of the stories old rangers whispered, the kind meant to scare rookies. Tales of mirrors in the woods, things that follow you step for step until you lose track of which sound belongs to you. Folklore, I'd always told myself. Psychology and camouflage. But standing there, breath fogging into the abyss, I wondered if those stories weren't warnings so much as confessions. A low groan drifted up from below, subtle enough I almost mistook it for wind. But wind scatters. This sound curled, deliberate, like something exhaling through clenched teeth. My skin prickled. I stepped back from the cliff, heart hammering, and that's when I noticed it. More prints. Not ahead of me this time, but to the side, half hidden in shadow where the ground sloped steep and narrow. The trail hadn't ended. It had shifted, continuing along the cliff face, invisible until you knew where to look. My throat tightened as I followed the beam. The prints curved, hugging the precipice, each one pressed as firmly as before. They moved not away from me, but parallel, like whatever made them hadn't leapt into the void at all. It was still moving, keeping to the edge, circling. The realization landed heavy. I wasn't being chased anymore. I was being flanked. The forest behind me crackled once, the faint crunch of weight settling on frost. My blood ran cold. I swung the light back across the trees. Still nothing. But the prints beside the cliff were freshening, damp soil glistening, as though the weight had just lifted. Something was close enough to leave tracks I hadn't seen seconds ago. And I understood. Whatever had been following wasn't gone. It was waiting for me to decide which way. The forest, like a lighthouse stranded in a sea of pines. From its narrow platform, I could see miles of black treetops rippling under the night wind, a living ocean that stretched to the horizon. The air was brittle and dry, carrying only the faint scent of sap and wood smoke. For a moment it felt like solitude in its purest form, the kind of isolation rangers either find comforting or unbearable. But that night, comfort was impossible, because I wasn't alone. At first I noticed it only as a discrepancy. The trees swayed together, their silhouettes bending in rhythm with the wind. But one shadow stood apart, tall, upright, and perfectly still. It wasn't shaped like a pine trunk, nor did it move when the others rocked. It lingered at the edge of the clearing, almost blending into the darkness, until my eyes adjusted and betrayed its outline. A figure, long-limbed, blurred at the edges, swaying as if breathing. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, tried to reset my vision. Fatigue can make the mind stitch phantoms into the dark. Scientists call it a peripheral illusion, the tendency to mistake random shapes for figures, the survival instinct that assumes danger where none exists. But when I raised my binoculars, the shadow didn't resolve into a tree. It thickened, a smear of smoke shaped like something that had chosen to stand upright. My chest tightened. I lowered the lenses, exhaled, then raised them again. In the fraction of a second my eyes had been closed. The shadow had shifted. It hadn't walked. I would have seen movement, but it was closer, several feet nearer the row. Base of the tower. My pulse stumbled. I gripped the railing until the cold iron bit into my palm. Adrenaline sharpened every sound. The whistle of wind, the groan of wood, the distant crack of a branch snapping somewhere unseen. I scanned the ground for tracks, but from this height, details dissolved into black. All I had was the silhouette, still, swaying, now undeniably facing the tower. My mouth went dry, every instinct demanding I descend, radio for backup, abandon my post. But something inside me resisted. If I left, I'd never know. And not knowing is its own kind of terror. I forced my gaze upward, toward the sky smeared with stars. The tower felt safe as long as I looked out, as long as I pretended the clearing below was empty. But I couldn't ignore the itch crawling up my spine, the sensation of being studied from beneath. When I finally looked down again, the shadow was closer still, just at the edge of the ladder. Panic surged, raw and electric. I scrambled down 2 steps, my flashlight clattering against the metal rail. Its beam swung wide, catching the rungs, in a stuttering arc. That's when I saw them. Prints smeared across the ladder itself, long streaks of resin-black hand marks pressed into the steel. Fresh, oily. They glistened as though something had climbed only moments before. The wind stilled. The forest hushed. And I realized, the higher I climbed, the closer the shadow would rise to meet me. I froze on the ladder, one hand gripping the cold metal, the other trembling around the flashlight. The black smears on the rungs glistened, tacky in the beam, as though whatever had touched them wasn't quite gone. The marks were wrong, too long, too thin, stretched like fingers pulled into wires. My breath plumed upward, pale against the stars, and I forced myself to inhale slowly, afraid the sound of panic would carry down into the clearing. Somewhere below, the shadow swayed, patient, like a metronome keeping time with my heartbeat. Thought of the stories we told each other on long night shifts, tales dismissed with laughter but whispered with unease, shapes in the tree line, watchers that appear when you spend too many nights above the forest. Some claim the tower itself acted like a beacon, drawing things not meant to be named. I had always filed it under exhaustion and fear of heights, tricks of the mind amplified by isolation. Yet here I was, clutching a ladder streaked with handprints, too fresh to be memory. I forced myself upward, rung by rung, each step groaning as though protesting the climb. The shadow seemed to respond, rising without motion, closing the invisible gap between us. I could feel it, not with my eyes, but in the way the air thickened, charged like the atmosphere before a storm. My skin prickled, hairs standing as if pulled toward static. The thought pressed into me like a blade. What if it was tall enough to meet me at the top? Halfway up I paused, chest tight, and swung the flashlight downward. The beam sliced across the clearing, trembling in my hand. For a moment, nothing, only the churn of branches, the breathless stillness of soil. Then the light passed over the shadow, and I saw it clearly for the first time. It wasn't flat like a silhouette. It had depth, a body of smoke folding over itself, edges fraying and reforming. It didn't flinch from the light. Instead, it seemed to drink it in, glowing faintly where the beam lingered, as though it fed on illumination rather than fled from it. My stomach dropped. I wrenched the beam away, but the afterimage clung to my vision, burned in neon against the night. When I blinked, it shifted again. No sound of footsteps, no rustle of branches, yet closer, always closer. I gripped the ladder tighter, the metal, biting my gloves, and tried to force logic into the chaos. Peripheral illusions, fatigue, the mind's desperate need to populate silence with threat. But illusions don't smear resin on steel. Illusions don't climb at the final platform. I swung myself onto the boards, chest heaving. The wind roared suddenly, rattling the tower, shaking the railing under my palms. For an instant I believed it might tip, hurl me into the clearing below where the shadow waited. I raised the flashlight again, hesitant, trembling, and aimed downward one last time. The clearing was empty. The shadow was gone. But when I turned to steady myself against the railing, black streaks marked the top rung behind me, and they were wet. The call came in just before dusk, the kind of report that usually ends with a ranger finding nothing more than a bad compass reading or a hiker stretched thin by exhaustion. "One tent missing," the voice crackled through the radio. Not collapsed, not torn by weather, missing. I packed light because I assumed the worst I'd encounter was a group of campers who'd panicked at their own shadows. But when I reached the clearing, the air told me differently. It was too still, as if the forest itself was holding back, a secret. The first tent stood upright, stakes driven firm, gear scattered around it in the familiar chaos of backcountry camping. But the second, the one reported missing, wasn't there. Not flattened, not dragged. Gone, as though the earth had swallowed it without appetite or noise. The soil where it should have been staked was bare, unmarked, no sign of canvas or rope. Only the silence remained, dense and suffocating, pressing on my lungs like water. Then I lifted my beam toward the trees. Nylon strands dangled 20 feet overhead, shimmering in the fading light, thin and torn like veins pulled from flesh. They fluttered in the still air, though no wind stirred. My stomach tightened. Tents don't unravel upward. Fabric doesn't crawl into branches. Yet here it was, threaded through the canopy like some grotesque offering. I crouched, running my glove over the ground where the missing tent should have been. The soil was gouged, not dug, but clawed, spirals carved deep, curling outward like the grooves of a massive fingerprint. No tool I knew could make such patterns. No animal native to these woods left marks like these. They were deliberate, insistent, a script written into the earth. My training urged me to document, photograph, catalog, but my gut whispered another truth. This wasn't absence. This was erasure. The remaining hiker paced the edge of the clearing, pale and trembling, insisting his friend had been inside when the tent vanished. His voice cracked as he told me the story. A snap like thunder, a sound of tearing, then nothing. He hadn't unzipped the flap, hadn't seen anyone leave. He'd only watched as his friend's shelter folded out of existence. His fear was contagious, threading into my own ribs like wire. I stepped back, scanning the clearing. The trees loomed closer, branches arching overhead like ribs sealing a cage. Every instinct I had screamed that this wasn't a place built for us. My flashlight caught. On another fragment, fabric snagged in bark 10 feet high, edges scorched as though burned. Yet no fire smoldered, no ash stained the soil. The wood smelled only of pine and iron, sharp as blood. I radioed the station, my voice steadier than I felt, and reported unusual findings. I didn't say what my eyes told me, because the words would sound unhinged. I simply logged it as evidence. But evidence doesn't explain why the forest felt alive. Listening, waiting. As night fell, the hiker retreated into the lone tent, zipper drawn shut with trembling hands. I stayed outside, pacing, cataloging details into my notebook, clinging to procedure as though it could shield me. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable snap of fabric in the wind, taut nylon straining. But when I turned, there was no tent, only the forest, sharper this time, like canvas being yanked against poles. My flashlight swept the clearing, catching only the jagged threads still tangled in branches. They swayed as if stirred by unseen hands, long ribbons twisting slowly in the dark. I told myself it was wind, nothing more, but the night was breathless, and every tree stood still. The noise rose once more, snap, pull, stretch, and I felt it inside my chest, as though the air itself was fabric being torn apart. I edged toward the sound, boots sinking into the soft earth, my light quivering across the spiral gouges in the soil. They seemed deeper now, more defined, like grooves pressed fresh. My mind raced with rationalizations. Erosion, frost heave, maybe the panicked work of an animal digging. But none of those could explain the order, the geometry and the curves, the deliberate symmetry that seemed almost human, yet too alien in its precision. It felt less like scratches and more like writing, etched letters I couldn't decipher. The hiker stirred from inside his tent, his muffled voice calling out, brittle and edged with terror. He asked if I'd found his friend. I didn't answer. How could I? What I'd found weren't signs of departure, but signs of removal. A tent doesn't vanish into air, doesn't lace itself through treetops like thread through a needle. I thought of his friend sealed inside, of how quickly fabric can become shroud when the forest decides to take. A sudden gust rushed through, not cold but warm, carrying the scent of iron. My throat tightened. Every instinct told me to run, but my body moved toward the trees instead, flashlight beam climbing the trunks where nylon strands glistened. Higher still, 20 feet above, the canopy seemed to shimmer, leaves vibrating as though strummed by an unseen hand. The snapping sound intensified. Not just one tent now, but many. A chorus of canvas pulled taut and ripped apart. The noise spiraled, surrounding me, until I couldn't tell direction. It came from everywhere, overhead, beneath, inside the soil. I pressed my palm against the ground to steady myself and recoiled. The earth pulsed faintly under my hand, a slow throb, as if something alive moved just beneath the surface. I staggered back, heart hammering, notebook slipping from my grip. The pages fanned open and caught a draft that shouldn't have been there, scattering across the clearing like pale moths. Then silence, sudden, brutal, absolute. My ears rang, in the absence, desperate for the sound to return. The forest had stopped breathing, paused in collective suspension. I raised my flashlight one last time, beam trembling, and saw it. A section of ground in the clearing now bare, flattened perfectly, smooth as if another tent had once stood there. The hiker's tent. My breath caught. I turned sharply toward where he had been moments before. The zipper hung open, swaying lightly, empty. No sound of retreating footsteps, no rustle of fabric dragged away. Just absence. And faintly, from the canopy above, the threads shifted again. One new strip of nylon dangling, fresh, dripping with something dark. Maps are supposed to be anchors. In the woods, they are more than paper. They are promises, a fragile tether between the known and the unknown. I'd trusted mine countless times, folded and refolded until the creases were soft as cloth. But that night, when I stopped at a fork in the trail, the map betrayed me. The path beneath my boots wasn't marked at all, erased as though it had never existed. In its place, the paper showed a curve to the east, a neat line leading toward a ridge I couldn't see. I glanced, up from the page to the soil at my feet, steady and real. The trail was there, but on the map, It wasn't. I pressed my finger against the ink, tracing the line as if pressure might conjure the missing path back into being. Nothing shifted. The paper crackled softly in my hand, stubborn in its silence. I told myself exhaustion was bending my focus. I'd been on patrol too long without rest. Neuroscience has a term for this: cognitive mapping. How stress and repetition warp your sense of where you've been, turning memory into a hall of mirrors. But my memory wasn't the problem. The map was. The forest pressed closer as I followed the trail anyway, the trees crowding like onlookers at a trial. Pines should grow straight, their trunks reaching skyward in rigid columns. Yet these bent subtly, curling in slow arcs that resembled the inked spirals on the page. My skin prickled. Each turn of the trail aligned too perfectly with the paper. Not in correction, but in conspiracy. It was as though the map wasn't reflecting the land. I was walking through a land rewritten by the map. I stopped abruptly, folding the page shut, shoving it into my pocket. The relief was immediate, like stepping out from under a gaze I hadn't realized was watching. Without the map, the forest was just trees and soil again, a body I could navigate by instinct and stars. But the reprieve didn't last. Minutes later, curiosity pulled me back. I unfolded the paper under my flashlight. The trail I stood on was gone again, replaced with curling lines like fingerprints pressed into ink. At their center, where the paper had once been blank, tiny shapes bloomed, circles layered upon circles, like pupils sketched in haste. Eyes, dozens of them. My breath caught in my throat. Paper doesn't hallucinate. Cartography doesn't grow. New features mid-patrol. And yet here they were, staring back at me from the folds, smudged as if they'd bled through from beneath. The rational part of me scrambled for explanations. Ink distortion from moisture, the artifacts of wear. But no amount of rain or folding could conjure eyes. I turned in a circle, flashlight beam slicing through the mist. The trees leaned at impossible angles, spiraling around me like ribs twisting into a cage. My sense of direction faltered, north unraveling into nothing. When I looked down again, the map wasn't in my hand. It had slipped from my grasp, fallen into the soil. Or maybe it hadn't slipped at all. Because when I bent to pick it up, it was already folded open, waiting. And the eyes were larger now, watching. I snatched the map from the soil, my gloves brushing the damp edges, and for a heartbeat, it felt warm, as if it had been held by someone else just seconds before. The paper crinkled like dry leaves, and the eyes inked into its surface stared with unnerving symmetry. They weren't random smudges anymore. Each one had a pupil, ringed with uneven lines like tree rings, layered evidence of growth. I closed the map quickly, my chest tightening. But when I pressed the folded paper to my thigh, I swore I could still feel their gaze bleeding through. I forced myself to keep walking, pushing toward the ridgeline I knew should anchor me. Without reference, the trail became instinctual. Follow the incline, mark the stars when they appear through the canopy, breathe steady. But when I dared to unfold the map again, the land beneath my boots seemed to bend in response. Where the ink once charted ridges, now it showed spirals, swirling inward toward a point labeled with nothing more than a blot. My breath clouded in front of me. A blot is a mistake, an imperfection in printing. But here, standing in a clearing that hadn't been there before, the blot looked like a destination. I hesitated at its center, the soil damp and darker than the ground around it. My flashlight trembled in my hand, catching the ridges of roots exposed like veins. The map crinkled, pulling tight at its creases, and when I opened it fully, the blot had spread, smudged into a dark pool that mirrored the shape of the clearing. It wasn't guiding me. It was recording me. Every step I took was being inked in real time. My rational mind revolted. I whispered the words I'd once heard from a geographer during training. Maps don't lie, but they don't tell the truth either. They're stories we force onto land. Maybe I was simply seeing the story I'd already feared. But then the paper shifted in the beam. its surface slick for a moment, as if the ink hadn't dried. My gloved finger brushed against one of the drawn eyes and it smeared, not outward, but inward, sinking into the fibers like something alive had pulled it deeper. Dot. The forest shifted. The trees around the clearing leaned closer, no longer upright, but curved, twisting as if drawn by invisible hands. My compass needle spun without anchor, and a low hum filled the air, vibrating in my ribs. The sensation was intimate, like the earth itself was breathing beneath me, sinking to my pulse. I staggered back, clutching the map, but the paper felt heavier now, saturated. Dot. When I finally tore my gaze from the clearing to the map again, the blot was gone. In its place, new lines sprawled outward, unfamiliar trails that led not to ridges or valleys but into shapes unmistakable, outlines of hands, palms open, fingers spread wide. They overlapped like layers of memory pressed into parchment. I dropped the map, heart pounding, and the forest went silent. Too silent. My breath echoed louder than it should have. Dot. And then, at the edge of the clearing, the trees shifted again. Not in the wind. There was no wind. They bent in unison, trunks curling until the outline they formed resembled the very shape I'd seen on the map. A hand. Enormous, skeletal, reaching down toward me, more dependable than roads, more immediate than any map. They tether us to one another across valleys and ridgelines, crackling proof that we aren't entirely alone in this vast wilderness. But every tether can fray, and sometimes, instead of safety, the frequency delivers something else. That night began with nothing more than static, the usual hiss that folds in when storms roll over distant peaks. But then, out of the noise came a voice I hadn't heard in 3 years. I froze, headset pressed tighter to my ear, disbelief striking like ice down my spine. The cadence was unmistakable. It was Owen, a ranger who'd vanished without trace during a winter patrol, his pack discovered weeks later, frozen solid at the base of a gorge. We'd mourned him, filed the reports, and buried what little was recovered. Yet here he was, breaking through the static as though no time had passed. His words were strained, warped by the crackle, but not a plea. They carried a shape, a purpose, a warning. Dot. He repeated a string of numbers, coordinates, but none I recognized. I jotted them down with shaking hands, ink bleeding across the page. When I checked against our maps, the location didn't exist. The grid dissolved before the numbers could settle, as though I was plotting points on a landscape not yet born. My chest constricted. Warnings only matter if you can follow them, and this one pointed into blankness. Dot. The static swelled, deepening into a hum that vibrated the cabin walls. A low, droning rhythm, too steady to be chance. It felt alive, synchronized to something unseen. My coffee mug rattled against the desk. I pulled the headset off, but the hum didn't stop. It bled into the room itself, as though the cabin had sprouted a second heartbeat. Dot. Science offers explanations. Atmospheric bounce, trapped signals echoing across the ionosphere, voices captured, like ghosts in layers of air. I'd studied those theories, comforted myself with them when strange bursts came across empty channels. But no textbook explains what happened next. The headset lay silent on the desk, unplugged, yet I heard my name. Not shouted, not accidental, but whispered with intent. The syllables slid through the air like a blade across cloth. I turned, searching the corners of the cabin. Shadows leaned heavy against the wood, stretching taller with every flicker of the lantern. My own reflection in the window startled me, pale and taut, but no other face stared back. Still, the whisper lingered, repeating my name with the rhythm of breath. I gripped the notebook, staring at the coordinates again. Ink smudged under my thumb, as though the numbers resisted permanence. The hum deepened, rattling the glass panes, until they shivered in their frames. Dot. And then Owen's voice broke through again, sharper this time, stripped of distortion. Just 4 words, delivered with clarity that carved into me like stone. Don't let it climb. The headset went silent. The hum ceased. Dot. But in that abrupt silence I realized something else. The cabin's walls were still shaking, not from sound, from weight. Something was moving against them. The walls groaned like ribs under pressure, the timber flexing with each thud that pressed against it. I stood frozen, breath locked in my throat, my fingers gripping the edge of the desk, until my knuckles whitened. "Don't let it climb." Owen's warning gnawed at me, echoing louder than the hum had. What could climb a tower of airwaves? What could anchor itself to dead frequencies? The thought unspooled in my head like wire snapping free, each coil sharper than the last. I forced myself to the window, flashlight beam trembling as it cut into the dark. Pines swayed at the perimeter of the clearing, their outlines stretched thin, but the space closest to the cabin was empty. No eyes flashed back, no body crouched beneath the eaves. And yet, the boards beneath my boots still trembled as though something vast pressed up from beneath, crawling its way higher, higher, closer. The radio hissed again. Only this time, I hadn't touched it. The headset lay silent, but the old base unit lit with a dull orange glow, its needle quivering on a channel I'd never set. From the speaker poured a low rasp, almost human, almost breath. Each inhale and exhale came jagged, distorted, as if the forest itself had leaned against the antenna to speak. Then, layered faintly beneath the noise, came Owen's voice once more, torn thin by distance but sharp with urgency. "Stay above it." I staggered back, my pulse hammering in my ears. Above it. My eyes snapped upward to the rafters of the cabin, beams heavy with dust, as though the roof itself was a lifeboat. My body rebelled at the thought, but some primal current drove me to climb. The ladder creaked beneath my weight as I pulled myself into the loft, the glow of the radio casting long, feverish shadows across the walls. Below me, the boards groaned, again, louder, as though something tested their strength. I pressed flat against the beams, flashlight extinguished, every nerve straining to hear. A new sound slithered up through the wood, not claws, not nails, but friction, a dragging like rope pulled across stone. It circled the cabin, slow and deliberate, tracing the perimeter as though memorizing its shape. My skin prickled, the whisper of my name threaded through again. But this time it wasn't Owen's voice. It was deeper, heavier, each syllable drawn out until the air itself vibrated with it. The static flared once more, erupting from the base unit with such force it rattled my teeth. And through the distortion, one last fragment from Owen, broken and rushed. "If it reaches the tower..." The transmission snapped, severed mid-sentence, replaced by silence so absolute I could hear the blood in my veins. I stayed in the rafters until dawn, every muscle aching, afraid to move. When the first light spilled across the clearing, the hum finally ceased. But when I climbed down, I found new marks on the outer wall. Streaks black and resinous, hand-shaped, smeared upward, as if something had been trying to pull itself inside. The radio was dark, dead as stone. Yet faintly, from the unplugged headset, I swore I still heard my name, spoken not as a call but as a claim. "Subscribe, if you dare."